Welcome to the EMN podcast, where philosophy meets disaster and uncomfortable truths meet the profession we call emergency management. This is not safe space thinking. This is the arena. Let's begin.
Well, welcome this morning to our podcast on the EM Network. My name is Andrew Boyarsky. I'm again filling in for Todd DeVoe, who's busy today, and I have the honor of leading our podcast. Title of our podcast today is Are We Managing Chaos? The Illusion of Preparedness in a VUCA World. So before we get to our topic and our guest for today, I have a couple of comments and corrections on my part from the last podcast. That was the first time I've done a live stream, so forgive me on that. One listener who I really want to thank you for commenting, correcting my ignorance on Star Trek, history and trivia. In Star Trek: The Next Generation, the character of Data did take command of a Starfleet vessel in several episode Redemption 2, Season 5, Episode 1, and in a two-part episode, Gambit, and Season 7, Episodes 4 and 5. So that was while, Commander Picard and Riker were away on a mission. And Data frequently was in charge of the bridge during a night shift in the episode of Data's Day in Season 4 and Episode 11. So I have my homework to do to go back and watch old episodes of Star Trek. That sounds like a lot of fun. Also, I want to shout out to listener Tom Carr, who cited a study that he conducted back in 2007. And most local governments, in his study, aren't able to document in-kind donations well enough to use as matching funding. So a lot of that money does get left on the table. Local emergency management capacity, capability, competence, and support are often thin. That doesn't enable them to do that. So that's from last episode. I want to introduce our guest today. Anthony Mangieri is the principal at the Mangieri Group and past president of IAEM Region 2. He's also the director of the Center for Disaster Science, Risks, and Community Resilience at Rowan University, and he's also an adjunct instructor at the American Public University System. He has over 40 years of experience in the field of emergency management at federal, state, and local levels. He's also a very close colleague of mine. And Anthony, I want to welcome you to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with everyone.
Great. Now I'm looking forward to our conversation because I know you have a lot to contribute here. So to start things off, we keep writing our emergency operation plans, our mitigation plans, our recovery plans, and so forth. We run exercises, TTXs, functional exercises, full-scale exercises, drills. We check our compliance boxes to make sure that we're in compliance with federal or state regulations or local county laws and requirements. But when the incident hits, do these things actually translate into effective performance? So that's the first question.
You hit on something that I think is very important to understand. We have spent the last decade or two, in my view, really working on compliance rather than preparedness. And I say that because many times we focus so much on meeting the requirements of FEMA, of the state, of local government to have an active plan that we fail to look at sometimes, not every time, and I'm generalizing, look at, are we increasing the preparedness dynamic of the entity that we're working with? And I think that becomes a concern when systems change. We're in the what if business. And, well, what if FEMA wasn't here anymore? What if we don't have a federal declaration? Prior to, say Katrina, we really relied on the relationship with NGOs and with other agencies. There were many a time when I worked at the Emergency Operations Center or a state EOC where I pursued agency-specific declarations rather than a FEMA declaration, Federal Highway or SBA or Department of Agriculture, things like that, because their programs were different or more targeted towards the need. There is a document called the Code of Federal Domestic Assistance that lists out, in theory, all the types of assistance, not just disaster related. And it's the emergency manager that creatively looks at those and looks for opportunity that will make a better prepared organization. And by the way, there's money available, and resources available, not just to government agencies, but nonprofits and traditional agencies that are looking for a bit of assistance.
Yeah, I think that's it's an important factor. It's one that I want to get to because I think of the shifting grounds underneath our feet. One thing I do want to step back and just define, because I think it's a term that perhaps not all people are familiar with, and I know we're big fans of using our acronyms, and that is what VUCA means. And VUCA is meant to define a very, basically an environment that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So therefore the term VUCA. And it was generally traced to the Army War College, where this concept has been taught as far back as 1987. And it is believed to originate with Warren Bennis and Burt Nannis, who wrote some leadership and management books and are thought leaders in those areas. And it was used to describe sort of the environment the Cold War environment and post-Cold War, really get a better bearing on things as they were changing. And I think it's very apt today with what we're dealing with. So, and I think, based upon what you just raised with in terms of FEMA and, that this is no longer, sort of a given, if you will. And I want to talk about, some of these assumptions, right, that we make. We make our planning considerations based upon assumptions. And a lot of those assumptions now are in question, right? I want to talk a little bit about some of those, of course, because we're dealing with a lot of factors that are suddenly changing. So, for example, you just mentioned the reduction in FEMA funding and FEMA coming in to pay under the Stafford Act for disaster declarations and, what we felt was a backstop and things like that. We're also seeing a dramatic increase, almost 40%, I believe, in gas prices, and that'll have repercussions throughout supply chains in terms of logistics for our own communities and populations, but also just in terms of goods and resources that we rely upon. Costs will just go up as a result. Travel costs, jet costs, transportation, etc. And then, our technological vulnerabilities and cybersecurity vulnerabilities vis-a-vis the war, things like that. That's to mention a few. Do you want to just comment on that? Just have any thoughts on that, Anthony?
Yeah, just a few comments, right? Our job is not to eliminate VUCA environments. It's where we live. And I think that that's an important distinction. We are the 1%ers. I know that's an old term, but I'm an old guy. Our job's not to eliminate it. Our job really is to lead organizations through the process, through the cycles that are existing. As emergency managers and public safety professionals, you've heard me say it many times, we bring calm to chaos. That's our ultimate objective. Let's start with volatility a bit. The pace of changes that are going on, especially in the past year, have absolutely outstripped our planning efforts. The planning cycle is really cast out the window because we're really supposed to update plans, policies, and protocols at every substantial change, right? That's why we look at plans after an exercise. But we have substantial changes happening on a regular basis. So cyber incidents, misinformations are dramatically spiking. Infrastructure failures now are starting to surface as a concern. We even have lone wolf and other types of domestic terrorism activity that is raising concern because, to use an older expression for emergency managers, we are at an absolute period of heightened risk. we are by definition, at a VUCA environment that is specifically triggered by care and policy. I'm not getting into the politics of it because that's not our job, but certainly preparing for the recovery response and coordination is our job. So extreme weather, it doesn't really matter what triggers it. It matters that we adapt. And that's really, the issue with volatility is it requires agility and adaptation. So we've got to keep going back to planning and make sure that we have those revisions and that we're talking to the people, by the way. It's not just revising the plan, it's revising the practice. One of the projects that I'm working on is defining a scope of practice for emergency managers. And I think that will help to start to trigger conversation. I know, trust me, I know that we're never going to come up with one set answer, one set view, one set anything. The old expression is if you get 5 fire chiefs in a room, you'll have 8 opinions.
Right.
But we've got to start somewhere, and we've got to start. What's the old consensus? We got to figure out what we agree on, so then we can work on what we don't agree on. So that's where I think we're at, and that's why this becomes such a critical time to have this discussion. Whether it's war posture, whether it's economics, whether it doesn't matter what's triggering. It matters that we build a prepared community, a resilient, prepared community.
So one of the things I want to address is this idea of this once a year or even once every 2 years. In some jurisdictions, they may be doing it once every 3 years, a hazard, a threat and hazard analysis, or a HIRA, THIRA, whatever you want to call it. That seems to me to be kind of a quaint idea at this point. That's one part of it, one part of the equation, right? Understanding risks. I mean, in the program and portfolio project management world, we talk about our risk register. So ultimately, that's what we're looking at, right? What are the potential risks? What are the potential impacts? And how do we pay down our risks in terms of mitigation, preparedness, prevention, that sort of aspect? And then the plans and making them. So understanding how we need to adapt and change those to make them living documents. Is that a correct understanding that we can't, it's not just a once a year thing. We need to be updating these in more real time on a regular basis?
Well, I think that goes to what I was saying about the discussion about, are we building plans, policies, and protocols simply for compliance? Or are we really, truly working on prepared communities? Think about the last incident you managed. What changed faster than your plan anticipated? And go back and look at that. That old argument. Oh God, we've all heard it, right? The plan lasts 15 minutes. Before chaos. And well, there's a reason for that, and you should be documenting that and going back and going, what do we need to revise? Plans should reflect realistic procedures, not regulatory or we really have got to build strategies that build a resilient community by truly listing out the process and looking for issues that have to be trained and coordinated. Unfortunately, there's us and a million other priorities in government. As you know, I was a town manager for 3 years, and during COVID, I ran a small community. And, yes, COVID was a critical issue, but so was creating a police department, so was ice removal, so was trash agreements, refuge collection. We're being pulled in a bunch of directions. I think that one of the things that we often don't talk about is the structure of emergency management within organizations. Where does it sit? How does it have access to policy and leadership as an advisor? Because I don't know if we want to direct. Every community is different, but I do know we want to advise. I mean, that we could at least agree on as a consensus. When you're building a new development, we should be there to have a discussion about, you're building it in a high hazard area, which, hey, but we need to really start to focus that uncertainty, and that the planning needs to focus on uncertainty so that we're creating new opportunities, new baselines as things change, and we're narrowing down the uncertainty, the unexpected. I know I'm going through the VUCA list, but it's a great way to catalog this discussion. Leaders who wait for perfect clarity. One of the things I teach in my leadership classes is leadership in crisis means making informed decisions with minimal information. That's. I wish I had data, but sometimes you just don't, and you make the best decisions.
I think any of the folks if you read the military strategists and folks like that, and it goes back to that saying, right? The first thing to die in battle is the plan. But as Eisenhower said, on that quote, is that planning is essential. It's not something we can really do without. And I think that planning creates the consensus. It creates the muscle memory and the group capability to be able to do that, right?
But don't forget, it's not the plan, it's the process that is essential and must be protected.
Well, it's part of that planning process to understand how do we, everyone, we talk about battle rhythm, we talk about going into a situation, it's understanding how do we all actually orchestrate and work this together, right? So in a sense, the emergency manager becomes more of a orchestra conductor, if you will, right? Who understands how each of these players, each of these groups come together to actually attack the problem, if you will, and to bring it to a resolution. One thing I just want to reflect on is, I think to your point, I mean, when I remember quite well following, Hurricanes Irene and Sandy, which was Tropical Storm Irene and Superstorm Sandy, but it was August of 2011, and then it was October of 2012. So a little bit more than a year apart. But that kind of operational tempo, we were still recording different after action reviews and reporting and all that documentation. You know how long that takes, right? And that recovery process from one incident to the next. There were so many different agencies, so many multiple agencies that had come together, different reports, different things that had to come together. And to a degree, at that time, I was in the center of the storm because I was directing coastal storm plan training. And so we rolled right into the Superstorm Sandy with a lot of the lessons learned, but a lot of them still not necessarily integrated into the training and other things that we had done. So the lived experience, I think, really helped. It was a great dress rehearsal in a way for Sandy, but there was still a lot to learn, a lot to incorporate. And I think that, to me, is kind of the mindset that we need to have today. Just one thing I do want to talk about, and that is this idea of complex and cascading risk events and things like that, because we've seen some of that with the various events that have taken place. So, for example, the wildfires that took place out in Los Angeles and Altadena and the Pacific Palisades well over almost a year and a half ago now. That was a case where I think we saw that. We saw these, you have a very well-developed emergency management capability out in California, but yet then just overtaken by an overwhelming hazard incident. So, yeah.
Well, remember now, the world has changed a bit in that nothing also is isolated. When we hit complex incidents, it really is important to understand that emergency management has to have access, coordination, facilitation, whatever term you want to use, to energy sources, both electricity, fuel, all of those energy elements that facilitate community redevelopment also are very critical to recovery. I can't recover a community if I don't have lighting, if I don't have gas, if I don't have... The second part of it is I can't recover a community if I don't have access to the road. So debris management becomes critical. But you also then have issues of water flow when you had the fire. You had issues of transportation management, healthcare. All of those things are interconnected now. There's a cadence that we have to address. Mm-hmm. Disruption of one domain actually can create cascade effect to all the others. LA, we had, or in the Palisades fire, we had we had a fire, a conflagration. We also, though, had a water flow issue. We had an evacuation issue. We now have a health issue. These are all triggered down the road and have to be managed as part of recovery. Recovery doesn't end just because the threat has mitigated. There are complexities to the threat as we mature the recovery process.
Yes.
Even money, people can't necessarily wait 2 years to begin the process of rebuilding. They'll move on. I mean, can you live in a hotel for 2 years while somebody argues out whether or not you and how you can rebuild your property? That investment becomes problematic in itself.
Yep. Yeah. So I think that I think a couple things I want to, because I know we're well into the podcast, so there's still some ground to be able to cover. So we're not going to be able to eliminate risk, right? There's always going to be that residual risk that we need to deal with. And I think understanding what that residual risk is and communicating that effectively to the community. And these are times when folks we're the messengers perhaps of that, but let me ask you, having been in your role, how do you communicate to a community? We can't completely eliminate risks, right? We're going to be dealing with them no matter what we do. So, I just came from a college road trip with my son, and we went through the South, and it was, I think, the first time I had actually driven in that area and stayed through that. It wasn't just driving through, but being through North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, and seeing some of the development that's going on there, and some of it just to do with data centers. So, right, and building these massive data centers, and I think that that's a whole other topic for another discussion, as well as new housing and other developments that are going on there. So, that's changing, right? But how do you have a conversation where you can approach this diplomatically, as my former boss and colleague Michael Stone likes to say, a diplomat is someone who can tell you to go to hell in such a way that you look forward to the journey or ask for directions. So, but how do you tell people effectively the bad news without being shot as the messenger?
I think our job as emergency managers and public safety and government in general, let's add our business continuity partners in this.
Okay.
Our job is to create clarity where really clarity doesn't exist. We have to make those connections for individuals so that crisis and preparedness makes sense. The old discussion we always had when I was a state mitigation officer is if I retrofit your roof for wind load in high hazard areas, and I go above the standard for wind load in your area, if I retrofit, it's expensive because you got to remove the roof, you got to remove the sheeting, you got to put hurricane clips in. The clips, none of that's expensive except for labor. But if I do it in the beginning, it's pennies comparatively.
Right.
But we don't orient people to have 30-year roofs. We orient people to get the best price for the roof. And so they're the kind of things, depending on your environment, new construction, retrofit, we've got to make it make sense to people. Mm-hmm. It's got to be an investment that's reasonable, that has some return. So we need to explain it in those terms to individuals and to businesses. And that's just one example of a million of risk factors. We're seeing enterprise risk management emerge in both public and private sector, where emergency management is part of the totality of managing risk. And that's because it makes sense to the corporate environment. So it works. It works to build capacity. It works to make sense. It works to communicate the process because people understand risk management in the corporate world. They've been doing it for decades or generations. But it also means communicating early and often to help with that ambiguity, to ambiguity is not confusion. It's really just a call for more information or for clarity. We often say, you can't make a decision because in your brain you don't have enough information. Your brain wants more data. It's normal human element. Unfortunately, we don't get that benefit. So, adaptive plans, not static plans, binders that sit on shelves, real-time situational awareness, help informing and educating leaders and policymakers on the perception of what's going on, your perception, as it compares to threat or risk to normal operations. Cross-sector coordination so that other agencies are involved and we're coordinating together. Continuity of leadership becomes a critical element. If I can't reach the CEO because they're on vacation and I have limited funds, how I often use this as an example in my classes and when I'm teaching business town managers and government professionals. How much authority do you actually have to spend? And people say no one's ever really, in some cases, people say, well, I could do whatever I need to do. Is it codified? Do you really have that somewhere in writing that you could do that? Exercise. If you don't practice it, you're not going to use it. You're not going to go down that path. We're building it at Rowan University, a lot of virtual reality and crisis management. It's not to play with new toys and visualization. It's to put, as you said, that muscle memory, to put you through the process so that you have a thought process. You've been down that channel. You saw what your decisions resulted in, and you could back it up a little bit. I'd rather you do that in exercising than in real time. So they're the new standards in my mind.
So if I could summarize, let me see if I can do a decent job of this, Anthony, is for incidents, when they hit, we need to practice on the speed and quality of our decisions, right? How do we decide in an efficient and expeditious manner without guessing as to what's going on? So we have a good understanding, because there's lots of information perhaps coming at us, some of it conflicting, but we need to deconflict and basically manage that misinformation that we're getting, right? Things of that sort, right? That's one aspect. Clarity of authority, you just mentioned. Do people know what they can do in terms of committing their resources and stuff like that, right? Having that adaptive capacity. How do we pivot when the situation changes? How quickly can we do that when when certain assumptions and things like that don't turn out, or the actual hazard increases, or we have compounding effects that we hadn't really thought about or planned for adequately? And then I think ultimately it's that institutional learning. Do the after action reviews that we've done change our behavior, or just the language of the plans? Does it change how we actually execute on? Does that sound like a relatively good summary of what we're looking at?
It does. I do think the one thing I would add is the secret sauce of confidence.
Okay.
I think that whatever it takes for leaders at any level of an organization to be confident with their decision making is what becomes essential. If it's reading the plan once even, and you feel a little more confident, read the plan. If you're signing a document, to me, if I'm signing a document, a promulgation statement, I really better make sure I know what's in that. And I've seen so many people sign that and go, you read this? Yeah, okay. And well, do you understand what it says? Do you understand the intent? The intent. Ooh. The other thing is that communities don't necessarily need to predict the future and should stop worrying about predicting every little thing and focus more on responding to threats that are a community. I don't think spaceships are going to attack a small town anytime soon. But, I probably should have a mass casualty plan if I have a major highway coming through town, or a railway infrastructure that, not that railways have incidents on a regular basis, but, low probability and high risk are still concerns, or high, you know what I mean? So I think that more clarity, more confidence, and more understanding of purpose are the secret sauce to this.
Yeah. So I think that's an apt one, especially, I mean, as it concerns, like we always talk about elected leaders' intent, right? Whether that's a mayor, county executive, city council, whatever that might be, who are making some decisions, making sure that they're informed as to what these repercussions, what impacts can happen, and then having those basic plans in place and understanding how they actually are executed. And I've seen a lot of plans that's, what I call shelfware or vaporware, so to speak, that it's there, but the folks who are actually responsible for it just don't carry it out. They're nowhere to be seen when, the recovery or, operation is supposed to happen. So I just, a couple things I just want to, again, just sort of amplify here for our listening audience. And I want to thank our listeners for the time that they've given us today. And we do want to hear your comments and thoughts. So please do share them with us. And I think just one thing is, I would reduce that reliance on the annual only review of, threats and hazards and risks that they pose. Setting a cadence for a more regular basis. I would say probably at least once a quarter, if not once a month, just to take a look at what's going on, just a scan of what's going on and understanding the implications. Is we're not going to be there to understand every risk and every potential impact of, let's say a zombie apocalypse, but we can focus on those things that we do expect to happen and an increasing degree to which they could happen. Turning these things into a living sort of planning board, and what the triggers are, understanding what the triggers are, and then making sure that we understand once that triggers happen, what are those immediate actions and who are the players associated with. That's good. Gets into the whole process and planning process aspect of it. And then, redesigning exercises to really question our assumptions, the assumptions on the cavalry and the federal government coming over the hill to rescue us. Because I think, again, as I talked to in our last episode, podcast episode, I think that, that reliance has sailed. And we need to, a given factor needs to be that we cannot rely on federal government for coming in to help with mitigation and recovery and in the response there. So, stress testing our system with that kind of assumption. Anthony, any other final thoughts before we close here?
Well, the one thing I was going to say is I wouldn't necessarily say FEMA has gone away, and I wouldn't necessarily say federal assets and support has gone away. We should not be planning reliance on one set of recovery finances. We should look at multiple.
Sure.
But the other thing I just wanted to point out is there are connections between that VUCA environment and EM and business continuity competencies. Operational agility. We often worry about how quick we can make informed decisions, time compressed decision making. I got news for you. It's a practice. It's not something you just learn to do. Making decisions in complex and stressful environments is something that needs to be practiced in that exercise environment. Also, as you point out, that dynamic planning, modular, flexible, adaptive planning, not once a year to meet compliance, once a month just to once a quarter, depending on the size of your organization, just to make sure you're up to speed. Situational awareness and interpreting risk become critical. They're the things that, as emergency managers, that to me is our scope of practice. These are the elements that make up our scope of practice, at least so far in what I'm researching.
I appreciate that. Well, again, I want to thank our listeners for staying tuned, and I want to thank Anthony, who is the director of the Center for Disaster Science at Rowan University and also principal of the Mangieri Group. And until we speak again or in our next podcast, I want you to stay safe and stay hydrated.
When the sirens scream out loud, or the voice that breaks the cloud, heads held high when things go wrong, will guide you through its strength and song. Disaster strikes without a sound, chaos chaos reigns, but we're around. Public safety in our hands, standing strong in every land. Emergency men and